So today we will talk about the new IAS Cader Rule 1954. Actually, Center has proposed an amendment in Rule 6 of IAS Cader Rule, which is related to the deputation of officer, and give a letter to the state, and state has to reply by January 25. So in this, there is actually an amendment in Rule 6 related to the officer, and that is related to the cadre officers to fill the vacancies at the central level. So there over the years there is a shortages of officers has emerged. So in this video we will try to understand what is the reason for the shortages of officers and which actually forced the government to propose an amendment in Rule 6 of deputation of officer of IAS Cader Rule, and what are the federal tension between the center and the state and what is the way forward. So let's talk about. So if you talk about why in news, recently the central government has proposed to amend the Rule 6 of deputation of officer. So before that we have to understand what is the deputation. So if you talk about the deputation, then some officer actually working at the state level at the initial point. So what happened that after the over the years of gain, when they gain the 8 and 9 years of experience, they have to deputate at the, and they are eligible to depute at the central level at the basically the deputy secretary. So remember that after the 14 years of experience they are available for the director level. So that is the deputation. So from the center to state, and again they went to, after the giving at services at the central level, they again depute at the state level, but the promotion criteria is actually recorded. So remember that. So that is known as the deputation. So there is an amendment in Rule 6 of the deputation of IAS Cader Rule 1954, and similar changes in the All India Services, which consist of Indian Police Services and Indian Forest Services. So remember that if you talk about. Now, what are the actually reason which forced the government or union government to take such a step? So remember that the huge shortages of officer at the state level and what at the union level. So union level there are the huge vacancies. So remember that if you talk about. So before looking at the what are the reasons, we have to look at some data. So if you talk about this data, then remember that there are the sanctioned strength of IAS and IPS officer all over India, if you talk about, which includes both the state and the center. If you talk about the 11,697 of IAS and IPS, but presently available, if you talk about, means the posted at present 9,279. So if you subtract this from this, then there are the vacancies of 2,418 posts are vacant of IAS and IPS officer, around the 20%. So that's why this has forced the government to take a step. So remember that. If you talk about, there are not only shortages at the union level but at the state level also. If you talk about Bihar, then remember that there are the sanctioned strength. If you talk about IAS officers, the 359, but presently available 202. So remember that if you look, there are around 150 plus vacant seats only in Bihar. If you talk about. If you talk about Telangana, actually Telangana wrote a letter to the PM to requirement of IAS officer. If you talk about 250 more IAS officers needed in Telangana, this is how actually the shortages of officers in India, if you talk about. So remember that if you talk about the Kerala, then remember that only what is the sanctioned strength, around the 52% of IPS officers are available in Kerala, and what is the sanctioned strength, out of that only 62% of the IAS officers are available in Kerala. So this is how the shortages of officers at the state level, and obviously this lead to the shortages of officer at the union level. Now we will try to understand what are actually the post vacant, what is the where the acute shortages of officer at the union level, what are the posts and why. If you talk about actually where is the requirement of officer, so remember that actually the most shortages of IAS officers, if you talk about at the deputy secretary level and the director level. So remember that at union level, but why? Remember that. So over the years, actually there is a shortages of IAS officers from the 1996 to 2012, and if you talk about deputy secretary level, 19 years of experience is needed, and at the director level around the 9 to 14 years of experience is needed to post at this level at union level. So remember that. So from the 1996 around the 2012 there is a shortages of IAS officer because of only the 55 recruitment of our officer at the union level through direct recruitment by UPSC. So remember that. That's why. So before we will also try to understand this, and that's why I will teach that why there is a shortages at most at this level. So remember that what is the reasons of the shortages of officers if you talk about. The first shortages is the liberalization in 1991. So what happened at 1991? As you know, the new economic policy came and privatization came, and government think that the privatization will take our most of the task, but this didn't took place. So what is the so there will be less work for the government, so there is a less requirement of officer, and that's why the government at that time reduced the requirement or recruitment of officers, you can say up to 55, and this is lead to the recruitment and huge shortages of IAS officers in India, and this took place from the 1996 and continued around 2012. So look at the amount. So around the 180 IAS has to recruit on 55. So look at the shortages and the gap, and this not till for 1 year or 2 years, but around the 16 years if you talk about. So that's why lead to the huge IAS officers and shortages of IAS officers in India, and today they are not available at the deputy secretary level and the director level, and that's why there is a huge shortages of the deputy secretary and director level. And if you talk about last year, there is actually a recruitment or the vacancies came out for lateral entry for both these posts, around the 27 for deputy secretary and 3 for director, no, 3 for joint secretary and 27 for director. So that's why there is a huge shortages of officers at this post. So because of this liberalization at 19, so the officers of that rank with experience is not available at present if you talk about. So remember that. Another is the reason why there is a shortages, dismissal of officers before the retirement during the present government. So if you talk about, obviously there are the shortages of officer over the year. So when in 2014 the new government came, and new government is actually known for the corruption free and most efficient government. So whatever officers has the corruption charges and inefficient officer lead to dismissal of that officer. So that actually compounded the matter. So obviously there is a shortages and dismissal of officer actually compounded the matter, and this lead to the more shortages of officer if you talk about. Another if you talk about, remember that state reluctance to send officer by not recommending offer through an offer list. So what happened? Actually there are some deputation criteria. So certain amount of officers you have to retain for the central deputation, or you have to send at the central level. There are the state quota at the different level from the different requirement. So every year what state says, actually they offer an offer list to the central government, and from that officers, this offer list consists of officers, and from these officers they have to depute at the central level. But over the years what happened? Through the notification, union government is saying again and again to send an officer, but they are not offering an offer list. Why they are not offering an offer list? I have already told you. According to some data, actually state itself has not officer. So obviously there is a shortages in state of there is a shortages of officer in state itself. So how they can send at the union level, and that's why there is a shortages at the union level if you talk about. So remember that. Another is the officers' reluctance to go at central secretariat at union level because of the Modi fear. As you know, as I have already told you that this government or present government is known for the corruption free and efficient government. So sometimes actually whenever the officer is inefficient, this lead to the heavy scold and sometimes dismissed, and that's why the officers are reluctant to go at the union level. And these are the 4 reasons which actually lead to the shortages of officers if you talk about. Remember that if you talk about the sources of this source, especially the reason of officers if you talk about, taken from the Divya Kirti sir video, if you talk about lateral entry video, you can watch that video if you want to comprehensive about the lateral entry if you talk about. So this is the, so these all the reasons over the years lead to the shortages of officers at the union level and force the union government to propose to amend the Rule 6 of the deputation of officer. Now we'll talk about what is the Rule 6 and what is the 4 proposed amendment. Now the 4 proposed amendment under the Rule 6 which is related to the deputation of officers in IAS Cader Rule 1954 if you talk about. So remember that first is the proposed amendment that states should make available the names of such officers who can be deputed to the center. Number of officers shall be decided by central government and CDR cannot be more than 40%. What do you mean by this statement? Means there are the certain number of officers will be given by the central government and the state has to decide the name of officer. That number will be decided by the central government, but the number of officers, what officers they have to send at the central level shall be decided by the state government. Remember that. And if you talk about this, means the central deputation reserve cannot be more than 40% of the sanctioned strength in the. If you talk about, there are the some sanctioned strength which consist of 100%. Obviously if there are the 100 officers, that consists of 100%, means the CDR cannot be more than 40%, means cannot be more than 40 officers. So remember that if you talk about. Another that in case of any disagreement, this clause is very important if you talk about. In case of any disagreement, the matter shall be decided by the central government and the state shall give effect within a specified time. This clause is very new and very contentious and the state have raised question of this clause. Remember that within a specified time. If you talk, if there is any disagreement, so this is similar to the concurrent list. If there is any confrontation in concurrent list, then the matter will be decided by the central government or parliament. This similar case is here, but that should be in a specified time. Means you cannot for the infinite time, you cannot say I will not take any decision. You have to take a decision within a specified time, otherwise the central government decision will prevail. Remember that if you talk about. Another is the third proposed amendment if you talk about. If state government delays and doesn't give effect, the officers stand relieved from the cadre from the date as may be specified by the central government. So if this matter went to the state or if the center delay the process, then center will notify and that officers will be considered as relieved from the state cadre and they have to deputate at the center. So remember that this is the third proposed amendment. If you talk about the fourth proposed amendment, that in a specific situation where the services of cadre officers are required by the central government in public interest, the state shall give effect within a specified time. So remember that here is the word public interest is very important. Means in case of any public interest, if central government is asking about the some officer or they want to depute some officers from the state government to the central government, then the state has to release that officer in the name of public interest. And as you know very well how actually public interest word is used in the name of politics. So that is all the four proposed amendment. Now due to this issue, actually there are some tensions between the state and central government are taking place. And the West Bengal Chief Minister has clearly said that the present union government is against the cooperative federalism. So remember that. And obviously all the state government, almost the state government has raised the concern over this amendment in the IAS Cader Rule and Rule 6 deputation of officer. So now we'll talk about what are the tensions of states, center and state if you talk about. So remember that firstly, if you talk about now in any condition, this central government decision will prevail. We need to understand this through the example. So remember that. If you talk about recently, there are some issues if you talk about recently in Bengal. Firstly related to the deputation of 3 IPS officers and another is the very important is the deputation of Chief Secretary of the West Bengal. Now what are the issues? So remember that. If you talk about the some of the IPS officers actually posted when there is the BJP chief. As you know BJP chief when going going to the West Bengal, then these are the officers which is actually on the duty, and that lead to the stone pelting on the car of BJP chief, and that lead to the deputation on the central government as the deputation at the central level of 3 IPS officers, as you know very well. But the West Bengal chief minister has clearly refused to reveal this officer. No such power lies with the state government after this amendment. So now in any condition, this central government decision will prevail. So similar related issue, if you talk about related to the chief secretary of West Bengal, when the West Bengal chief minister who actually not attended the disaster management meeting with the prime minister, then the central government has asked or report at the center by the chief secretary, but chief secretary refused to actually send the report, and that led to the central government asked for the deputation, but again the West Bengal chief minister refused to relieve the officer. So that's why in any condition now the central government decision will prevail irrespective of the condition. This is the condition, and that's why the state government actually fearing. So remember that. Another is the concurrence of officers not needed, means unwilling officers have to go if demanded. So as you know, as I have told you that what are the reasons at the shortages. So one of the reasons actually officers don't want to go at the union level. So if there's some unwilling officer or they don't want to go, now they have to go because the central government is asking about that officer. So remember that. So although this is not the bigger problem because IAS officers have to serve. It is not about willingness and unwillingness. They have to serve. Either they have to serve at the state or they have to serve. Their duty is to serve, irrespective of the at the center and the state. So this is not the bigger problem, but yet problem, because if there is a willingness, then obviously they will be motivated, they will do more tasks, or if they are unwilling, obviously there will be low motivation sometimes. So these are the reasons actually. That's why this is one of the issue if we talk about. Another is the specific situation is the clause. As I have told you that within a specified time and a specific situation in the clause, if you talk about, lead to the misinterpretation and subject to the more politicization. So as I told you, this kind of politicization can take place in case of such words. So remember that. If you talk about these rules actually solving the problems or complicating the matter. So now the question arises, actually these are the rules which is trying to amend the Cadre rule, actually solving the matter and complicating the matter. So we need to understand at the holistic manner. So remember that. Firstly, as I have already told you, there are the shortages of officer at the state level, and if state will reveal the some officers, obviously it will fill some vacancies at the central level. It will lead to the more shortages at the state level. Now what is the solution? Another is the solution if you talk about at the union level, there are the more and more domain expert can be hired through the lateral entry. Lateral entry is the one of the most solution at this present. This is a problem for a short time, not a problem for a long time. So short term problem can be solved through the lateral entry if you talk about, rather than there is already shortages at the state level, and if you reveal the some officers from the state and deputed at the center, then it will lead to the further shortages of officer at the state level. So lateral entry, because you have to pay the same salary, same accommodation to the lateral entry officer, and obviously which will be deputed at the from the state to at the central level. So lateral entry is one of the most efficient solution. Another is if you talk about UPSC has to take care of this issue, and there are the shortages of officers, then they have to recruit more and more officers by the direct recruitment. So over the years this issue will go down and the subsequent issue will not come. So remember that. If you talk about this matter, then obviously center and state has to talk more and more to actually reveal this some officer actually. So if there are the shortages at the union level, while not affecting the state functionary, they have to depute some officer at the central. So they have to talk rather than to amend. Obviously the amendment will force the state, and talk will lead to the more and more cooperative federalism, and federal tension will reduce. So this is all about. So what is the summary of this video? If you talk about, remember that there are the changes in the IAS Cader Rule 1954, and that is the 4th amendment. Actually within a specified time and a specific situation is the new clause, and obviously the central government in all the proposed amendments, central government decision will be prevail, the irrespective of the condition. This is the main. So thank you guys, hope you will like this video.